The girl adjusted herself using a car window. The millionaire CEO inside fell in love instantly. But there are moments that don't feel like moments at all, until you realize they changed everything. It started with a fall, in the rain, on a Tuesday when the world was already too heavy for one woman to carry. Her lunch scattered, her pride bruised, her heart already used to breaking, didn't even flinch. But then, he spoke. Not with pity, not with charm. Just presence. A voice that had once stood in boardrooms but now lived between alley walls. He thought he was a beggar. He thought she was just another kind soul. Neither of them was right. And neither of them would ever be the same again. Some mornings don't wait for bad news. They carry it in the clouds, in the way the air bites, in how the world seems to turn a little slower. Julia Bennett tugged her coat tighter, a crumpled resume in one hand, a warm takeout box in the other. Her shoes were soaked through before she even reached the end of the block. The interview was in 20 minutes. Her last hope this month. Rent was due. Again. She took the alleyway shortcut without thinking. She always did when she was late. Always thought maybe shaving off 2 minutes could shave off a piece of her reality. The sidewalk was slick, papered in old flyers and yesterday's rain. He never saw the puddle. One wrong step, one twist of her ankle, and gravity did what gravity always does. It reminded her that rock bottom has no floor. She fell hard. Her food flew. Rice and roasted chicken scattered like ash over wet cement. Her resume soaked through instantly, the ink bleeding like it was embarrassed to be seen. For a moment she just sat there. Her knees stung, her pride throbbed. But worse than the fall was the silence that followed. The kind of silence that wraps around you when no one stops to ask if you're okay. Until someone did. "Are you hurt?" A voice came from behind a stack of boxes near the dumpster. She blinked toward it, and out stepped a man. Disheveled, gaunt, mud on his sleeves, a torn beanie barely covering matted hair. He looked like someone the world had forgotten. They were sharp, a kind of still blue, like something you find at the bottom of the ocean. Quiet, old, and waiting. Julia scrambled to gather what was left of her lunch. "No, I'm fine," she muttered, swiping a grain of rice from her jacket. "Just my luck." The man bent slowly and handed her the dented container. There was still a bite of chicken left inside. "You dropped something more important than food," he said gently, eyes flicking toward the resume. She looked down at the waterlogged paper, the cheap ink now smeared beyond salvation. Her chest tightened. She didn't want to cry. Not again, not in front of a stranger. But the weight behind her ribs didn't care about timing. "I can't do this today," she whispered more to herself. "You already own her." He said it like it was obvious, like the act of standing up was enough, like kindness didn't need to be earned. Then she noticed the gash on his foot. A thin line of red had seeped through his sock. The way he shifted his weight confirmed what she feared. It hurt more than he let on. "You're bleeding." It's not nothing," she said, opening her backpack. She had a few tissues, a mini alcohol bottle, some tape from her old desk job. She hadn't packed it for anyone. But something about this man made her move without hesitation. "This'll sting. I've had worse." He winced anyway. "You live here?" she asked, nodding toward the alley. "For now," he said, "it's just temporary. I'm somewhere between who I was and who I'll be." It made her pause. "Most people just say they're homeless," she said softly. He smiled, just slightly. Not wide, not showy, but it lingered, warmed the air between them like steam from a coffee mug. A rumble echoed from her stomach, loud enough to make her blush. He reached into his worn coat and pulled out a small paper bag. He stared at him. "You're offering me food?" "Only if you take it with butter," he teased. She laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt like the only thing holding her together in that moment. They sat on the curb, sharing bread like old friends who hadn't seen each other in a while. A few crumbs fell into the gutter. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. Somewhere in the distance, the city kept moving. Cars honking, lives rushing, always late for something. "And Julia," she said finally. He looked at her, really looked the way people do when they're trying to remember something important. You sure you're okay? He asked again. Not even close, she said. But I'll get there. He nodded like he believed it. And then she realized something strange. She was late. The interview, the job, the reason for everything that morning, gone. She stood, brushing her jeans off. Well, that's it then. No job, no lunch. And now I'm eating bread on a sidewalk with a man who has strangely beautiful eyes. You think my eyes are beautiful? He said, smiling. He blushed. I meant metaphorically. No. She rolled her eyes. Thanks for the bread, David. He nodded. Thanks for the bandage. He turned to go, but hesitated. I walk this way every morning, she said over her shoulder. I'll be here, he replied. Fade out with her footsteps echoing. Her life has not changed yet, but the first thread has been pulled. And love, as always, begins with something broken. Chapter 1. The bandage that started it all. Julia's tiny one-bedroom apartment on the south side of Chicago. Nightfall. Rain ticking at the windows. Julia hadn't intended to stop. She didn't plan on going back to that alley after what happened that morning. But she did. Not because she was reckless. Not because she was lonely. But because something about the man she met, the man with the bleeding foot and the old philosopher's eyes, stayed with her, like a line from a dream that won't quite let go. So, at dusk, with her umbrella half broken and a grocery bag filled with instant noodles, she walked back down the same alley. The rain had slowed to a mist. Steam rose from the gutters. And there he was, sitting on a crate, arms wrapped around himself for warmth, his foot still wrapped in her makeshift bandage. His eyes lit up when he saw her, not in surprise, but in recognition, like he expected her. You're still here, she said. He came back. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Julia shifted the grocery bag and cleared her throat. I have a tiny back room. There's a heater that only works if you hit it 3 times, and the bed is barely a bed, but it's warm. Just for tonight. David didn't move. I'm not crazy, she added quickly. I'm not asking you to, whatever. I just figure it's freezing and your foot's worse. He looked down, his sock was soaked, and the bandage had darkened with old blood. I won't ask questions, she said. It's just a room, just one night. David met her gaze, studied her face, not with suspicion, but with a quiet reverence, like he was memorizing the moment. Then he nodded. She held out her hand. He took it. The walk to her apartment was quiet. David limped, but with pride, not pity. He didn't lean on her. He didn't drag his steps. He walked like a man who still had somewhere to go, even if he no longer knew where. Julia lived in a building built in 1924, the kind with creaking pipes and a smell of old varnish that clung to the walls like perfume. Her apartment was up 3 narrow flights. By the time they reached her door, David's breath was labored. He opened it quickly and waved him in. Welcome to the castle, she said. Don't mind the mess, or the smell. That's either the heater or the neighbor's cat. David stepped inside like he was entering a cathedral. He didn't gawk or compliment. He simply looked, really looked at the picture of her grandmother by the window, the worn books stacked under the lamp, the chipped coffee mug with a cracked heart logo. Your grandmother? He asked, nodding to the photo. She raised me, Julia said, pulling off her coat. She's in the hospital now, pneumonia. I visit every night. She used to say... He stopped. He was still looking at the photo. Something in his expression shifted, softer. She reminds me of someone, he said quietly. Julia didn't press. Some things were better left to silence. She showed him the back room. It was barely wide enough for a twin bed, but it had clean sheets and an electric radiator that groaned when turned on. You can rest here, she said. Bathrooms down the hall. Towels in the cabinet. Just don't touch the heater unless you have a death wish. David smiled faintly. Noted. And this is just for tonight, she repeated. Just tonight. Julia couldn't sleep. She lay on her side, watching headlights crawl across her ceiling like ghosts. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the radiator and the occasional creak of wood beneath David's feet. It should have felt strange. Having a stranger in the next room. A man whose last name she didn't know. A man who said things like, "I'm between who I was and who I'll be." But it didn't feel unsafe. It felt just like something inside her had finally stopped running. She got up once just to check. The door to the back room was cracked slightly. She peeked through. David was sitting upright, staring at the ceiling. Not asleep, not fidgeting, just... He almost said something but didn't. He closed her door softly and let herself drift off. The morning came too soon. Her alarm went off at 6:30 a.m. An old digital radio that buzzed instead of playing music. She yawned, tied her hair in a bun, and stumbled toward the kitchen. The scent hit her first. Coffee. Real coffee. He stepped into the kitchen for David stood barefoot, hair damp from the shower, wearing one of her grandfather's old flannels she kept for sentimental reasons. He looked oddly natural, like he belonged, like this was something they did every morning. "You made coffee?" she asked. "I tried," he said. "Could be terrible. Might be good, you'll be the judge." Julia raised an eyebrow. "I didn't know I owned real coffee." He did. It was hiding behind the oatmeal. He handed her a cup. She sipped. "Oh, straw." He was aiming for "wake the dead straw." "Well done." They both smiled. It was quiet again, but not awkward. David leaned on the counter and looked around. "You live alone?" "Mostly, except for the radiator and the mice." "They pay rent?" "Not yet." They sipped coffee. Julia glanced at him. "You seem different today. Sleeping under a roof can do wonders. No offense, but you don't act like someone who lives on the street." David didn't answer immediately. "I've lived a few lives," he said. "The one I left behind, the one I fell into, and maybe this one now." Oh, she didn't push. You just nodded. As she gathered her things for work, her notepad, a fresh copy of her resume, David paused by the door. "Julia," and she looked up. "Thank you, for last night, for the bandage, for not asking too much." He hesitated, then smiled softly. "Try not to burn the place down while I'm gone." "No promises." As she stepped out the door, Julia had no idea that her world had already shifted. She didn't know that the man in her guest room had once stood at the top of a glass empire, that he had vanished from headlines, from boardrooms, from every room but hers. All she knew was that when she turned the corner at the end of the block, she was already thinking about whether he liked cinnamon in his coffee, and whether he'd still be there when she came back. Chapter 2. The Man Who Cooked in Silence. It was supposed to be one night. That's what she'd told herself when she brought him in from the rain. One night, out of compassion, maybe guilt, out of impulse, but certainly not permanence. Yet 2 days later, David was still there. And stranger still, she hadn't asked him to leave. Julia stood barefoot in her tiny kitchen, wrapped in a fleece cardigan, watching him from the doorway. He hadn't noticed her yet. He moved like someone trained in quiet spaces, efficient, gentle, almost reverent. He was cooking, not just making toast or pouring cereal, but actually cooking. The skillet sizzled low with oil. Fresh garlic danced in the pan. On the counter, sliced sweet potatoes, eggs, parsley. He moved with confidence, but no showmanship. It wasn't performative. It was careful. Like he was remembering something as he did it. She cleared her throat. He turned. "You're up early," he said. "I could say the same to you. I thought I'd repay you. Breakfast seemed like a good start." He walked toward the counter slowly. "I didn't even know we had food." "You did. Back of the freezer, bottom drawer, hidden under expired peas and resentment." He laughed, eyes flicking to the chopping board. "You used the good olive oil. Only the best for the woman who saved my foot." She raised a brow. "You're still limping." "Saving's a process." He sat at the table and watched him finish the eggs. Her apartment had never smelled like this before. Like warmth. Like someone who knew what they were doing. "You don't cook like someone who's been sleeping behind dumpster." He glanced at her but didn't reply right away. Instead, he plated the food. Delicate portions. Careful presentation, not fancy but deeply intentional. He handed her a fork. "You've had a few past lives," he said. She took a bite, her eyes widened. "Okay, this is really good." He smiled, no explosions. "At the win." Julia took another bite, then leaned forward. "Let me guess, former 5-star chef who lost everything in a poker game." "Close," he said, "though I don't gamble, not with cards anyway." She narrowed her eyes at him. "You're very mysterious, you know that?" "I get that a lot." "You're also annoyingly good at everything. Cooking, fixing lights, reorganizing my bookshelf." He alphabetized by author and genre. It was chaos. She gasped playfully. "Excuse you, that was curated chaos." He laughed, really laughed, and for a brief moment she saw something in him that had been missing since the day they met. Not just kindness, but ease, like a man remembering how to exist without hiding. Then his gaze drifted toward the bookshelf. "You have Steinbeck next to Harry Potter." It's called sacrilege. He threw a crumpled napkin at him. He caught it without flinching. "You're fast," she said. "Used to be. Muscle memory." "And what muscle teaches someone how to rewire my broken radiator?" "The kind that ran operations, managed systems, oversaw teams." He paused. "What did you used to do?" He was quiet for a beat too long. "Nothing worth talking about," he finally said. She didn't question. Later that morning, Julia left to visit her grandmother. She hesitated at the door, keys in hand, bag slung over her shoulder. David stood behind her, arms crossed casually. "I'll be gone a few hours," she said. "I'll be here. Try not to rearrange my furniture while I'm gone." "No promises." He smirked. "Seriously though, thank you." "For breakfast." He nodded. "He deserve it." He left before her chest could betray how that made her feel. It wasn't until she returned that evening that she noticed something strange. Her apartment was and not just tidy, clean. The dishes were done, the counter shined, the bookshelf was now perfectly aligned. Even the radiator no longer groaned when she walked past. In the hallway she froze. Her door had been locked. The moment she stepped inside, David appeared from the back room, drying his hands with a dish towel. "Welcome back," he said like it was normal. "What did you do?" He looked around. "Cleaned. Fixed the heater. That bookshelf was a war crime, and you had 3 light bulbs out." He dropped a bag. "Are you secretly an electrician? A retired janitor? What is your deal?" "I told you I've lived a few lives." "No, see? Normal people don't just happen to know how to fix electrical outlets and saute garlic to perfection. You didn't even blink when the kitchen faucet started smoking yesterday." "That's because I replaced the pressure valve." He gawked. "Who are you?" David hesitated. Then, without a word, he walked over to the bookshelf, pulled out a copy of The Alchemist, and opened it to page 47. There, stuck inside, was a folded piece of notebook paper. Julia frowned and took it. In her own handwriting from a year ago, one of the quotes she used to remind herself to keep going. "You are more than what the world sees. One day, von Sabanko was saying." Beneath it, in neat, unfamiliar handwriting, another note. "The world already has. It just needs time to catch up." Julia looked up. "You read my journal?" "No," he said. "Just that page. I wanted you to find it." He stepped back, overwhelmed. He was sick. Then he spoke quietly. "No, not really." That night, they didn't talk much. She didn't ask more questions, and he didn't offer answers. But she let him stay, not because she wasn't afraid, but because somehow she felt more seen by a man with no past than anyone who ever claimed to love her. They cooked again, and she didn't argue. They ate in silence, but it was the kind of silence you don't rush to fill. It was the kind that made room for something else to grow. Chapter 3. Julia awoke to the smell of cinnamon and something gently toasting. He blinked toward the kitchen, expecting to find the usual chaos of her too-small apartment and her even smaller paycheck life. but instead found David, humming faintly, standing at the stove. He had tied her grandmother's old apron around his waist. Inside out. The image was so surreal she almost laughed. "Morning," she mumbled. He turned, smile easy. "There's bread. Real bread. Not the mystery toast you've been surviving on." "You've been here 3 nights," she said groggily. "You're starting to act like a husband." He smirked. "Don't worry, I'm a low-maintenance roommate. I come with free breakfast and minor home repairs." "And cryptic metaphors," she added, sliding into the chair. "Those too." The coffee was already poured. She sipped slowly. It was strong but warm. "So," she said between bites of cinnamon toast, "what are you doing today?" He shrugged. "You're not planning to secretly rebuild my entire apartment, are you?" "No, just refining it." She rolled her eyes. "You're ridiculous." "Not you, Scoop." He smiled. She didn't realize how much she'd missed waking up to someone who didn't want anything from her. By noon, Julia had her laptop open on the couch, working on yet another job application. Her eyes burned. Her resume, half-drenched from the alley 2 days before, had been typed again but still felt stale. Too many bullet points, too few actual wins. She leaned back and groaned. David walked in, cowl draped over his shoulder from fixing the shower knob. "Trouble in paradise?" he asked. "My resume looks like it was written by a nervous intern with an identity crisis." "May I?" He hesitated. "Sure. I mean, it can't get worse." David sat beside her and read silently. His eyes scanned the screen with speed and sharp focus. "You worked at Baker Tack?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "For 7 months," she said, "before the layoffs." "You managed 5 client accounts. Alone?" "Yeah. It wasn't in the job description, but when everyone else got cut, someone had to handle the chaos." David didn't reply. He kept reading. Then, quietly, he said, "You buried your achievements under filler. Why?" He shrugged. "No one likes a girl who brags." He looked up at her. "No one hires someone they can't see." So that silenced her. He stood and retrieved his reading glasses, an item she hadn't noticed before, then sat back down, adjusted the font, and started editing. She watched as he deleted entire sections, rewrote headers, shifted language from passive to bold. He replaced assisted in with spearheaded, supported with became led, and he trimmed 1.5 pages into one concise, compelling sheet. Julia blinked. You're good at this." "I used to be good at a lot of things," he said, barely looking up, "before I let people talk me into forgetting that." When he finished, he slid the laptop back to her. "There, try sending that version." We started at it. Julia Benedict, projective problem solve a human. Swiss Army knife. He laughed. "Did you actually put that? I figure it's better than desperate and chronically underpaid." He looked up at him, softened. "Thank you." He gave a small shrug. "You did the work. I just moved the words around." That evening, as Julia returned from a grocery run, her phone buzzed. Subject: Intercoin. "Dear Ms. Bennett, we reviewed your application and would love to schedule a conversation." She froze on the sidewalk. Phone in. "Holy crap," she whispered. When she burst through the door, David was wiping down the counter. "I got an interview." He looked up, amused. "Already?" "They said my resume was compelling and clear." She tossed her phone on the couch. "That's the word they used." He smiled, that quiet, satisfied kind of smile that people give when they already knew the ending. "I told you, you just needed the world to see it." He stared at him. "Why did you help me?" He paused. His answer came softer than before. "Because I know what it's like to be invisible." Later that night, after Julia had gone to bed, David sat alone in the guest room. The glow of her laptop lit the corner of his face. He reached into his worn backpack and pulled out an old newspaper clipping, creased and weathered. The headline: David Hale, CEO of Hale and Gray Technologies, presumed dead in helicopter crash. Beneath the text, a photo of himself, clean-shaven, tie perfectly knotted, arms folded in front of the Hale building. He stared at it for a long time. Then, without hesitation, he tore the page in half and fed it piece by piece into Julia's small trash bin. He closed the laptop, turned off the light, and for the first time in months slept without dreaming. Chapter 4: The Man in the Photograph. Julia didn't believe in signs. Not since her mother died, not since her grandmother got sick, and certainly not after being ghosted by 3 employers in the same month. But that day something felt different. She had just stepped off the bus from the Indigo Systems interview, still wearing her lucky blazer, a size too big, and holding a coffee she'd been nursing like a security blanket. The meeting had gone well, better than well. She hadn't stuttered, she hadn't apologized, and when they asked about her biggest achievement, she'd smiled and said, "I'm still here. Still showing up." But now, as she walked past the corner newsstand, her eyes caught something. A photo. A name. There, on the front page of a folded newspaper behind the smudged glass, was him. Not exactly him, not like he looked now, but him. David Hale, CEO of Hale & Gray Technologies, missing for 8 months following helicopter incident. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it. The vendor, an older man with a White Sox cap, barely looked up. $2. He handed him 3 and clutched the paper like it might disappear. Back at the apartment, David was in the kitchen, again, cooking, again. And again, too calm, too quiet, like a man who didn't belong in any one moment too long. He said, walking in like the air had thickened. He looked up. "Hey, how'd it go?" He held up her hand, cutting him off. He unfolded the paper and placed it on the table. He stood. His hand stopped moving. His jaw tightened just slightly, and then he exhaled. There it was. The photo, the headline, his name. Julia didn't speak. She didn't need to. He stared at it for a long time. Finally, without any drama, he said, "You know." Julia nodded. "Is it true?" He walked around the counter and sat. "I didn't lie," he said. "Not exactly, I just didn't correct your assumptions. You told me your name was... You told me you lived on the street." He narrowed her eyes, but not before being a billionaire tech genius with a private helicopter. He looked down. That part used to be true. The apartment was quiet, only the sound of the burner ticking low in the background. She sat across from him. "I need you to explain this," she said softly. "Not the money, not the headlines. You. Why were you there that day, in that alley? And why didn't you tell me?" David leaned back slowly. "I lost everything," he said. "Not the company. That came later. First, I lost my brother. Cancer. Fast. Aggressive. And then, I stopped caring." Julia swallowed. "He was supposed to be flying to a summit. I told my board I'd be back in 48 hours. The helicopter went down in the fog before I even got on it. Everyone thought I was on board. I let them believe it." "He faked your "No," he said. "I just didn't correct them. By the time I realized what had happened, how fast the rumors spread, I was already 2 states away with nothing but a duffel and a name no one asked questions about." He took a slow breath. He just left. He wasn't running from the company. I was running from what I had become, a man who built machines to talk to people because he didn't know how to anymore. Julia's voice cracked. "So what are you doing now? Hiding?" "He was," he said, "until I met you." That night, dinner sat untouched. They didn't fight, they didn't yell, but there was a distance, like walking through fog, reaching for someone you can barely see. Julia paced the apartment, while David sat in the armchair by the window, fingers steepled, eyes unreadable. "I don't care about the money," she finally said. "I know. I care about the fact that you stood in my kitchen and let me think I was helping you when you could have helped yourself 100 times over." "I didn't want help," he replied. "I wanted to feel human again." "And did you?" she asked, turning toward him. He looked at her, then truly looked. "With you? Yes." The silence cracked between them. Then Julia said, "You can stay here. Tonight. But after that, I need space." He nodded, not fighting it. "Just one thing," she added. "What?" "Don't lie again, even by omission." "I promise." Didn't she? The newspaper lay open on her nightstand, David's photograph looking up at her like a ghost from another life. He'd been sitting across from her, laughing, cooking, quoting books he wasn't supposed to know, and every single moment had been real. But now it all felt too big, too strange, too fragile. When morning came, she stood at the kitchen counter, staring at the cracked window, wondering if she'd ever be able to trust what she saw again. Then her phone buzzed. Subject: Offer. Indigo Systems. Dear Ms. Bennett, following yesterday's interview, we're excited to offer you a position. He didn't smile, not right away. But she forwarded the email to David with a single line. You were right, the world saw it. He didn't reply. But when she walked into the living room a few minutes later, he was already gone. Just a sticky note left behind. You'll come back if you ever ask me to. Not as a CEO. Not as a guest. Just as the man who remembers how you made him feel. Chapter 5. The name on the laptop. The apartment felt quieter without him. Not loneliness. Lucia had known loneliness. This was something different. With a shadow. She hadn't heard from David since the sticky note. No texts, no calls. The couch was still perfectly made. The little bag of cinnamon she'd bought because he liked it still sat untouched on the kitchen shelf. She had accepted the offer from Indigo Systems. The first week had gone well. A steady paycheck, kind colleagues, a desk with her name on it. But the moment she came home, the quiet swallowed her whole. She still poured 2 cups of coffee. Out of habit, out of memory, out of hope. On Thursday night, after finishing up a resume for her friend Carly, Julia opened her laptop to check something, only to see a browser tab open. Grin. He hadn't left anything open that morning. Click. It was a cached site, an internal directory, encrypted, full of unfamiliar file names and folders marked H&G Legal Victor_Acquisition, Trust Agreements, Digital Shelves. Then she saw it. A small gray folder at the bottom of the screen. The Harvin_Truth_Backup. Julia froze. She remembered now. David had been using her laptop the morning after her interview. He'd said the system was running slow. She hadn't thought much of it. Her heart pounded. He clicked the folder open. Inside, PDFs, screenshots, audio recordings, one titled simply, Meeting, Meteor/Director Cole, June 2. He pressed play. Once the merger goes through, a man's voice said, crisp, arrogant, confident. No one will trace it, especially not David Hale. He's a ghost, a headline from last year. The company is ours. Julia clapped a hand over her mouth. Another Vimeo Shell Corporation routing quotations, routing numbers, hidden accounts, signatures forged under Dabut's name. It wasn't just corporate betrayal. It was theft. System, cold, ruthless. And David had been trying to stop it. The knock at the door came just as she sat back in stunned silence. A firm, deliberate knock. We opened it without thinking. David stood in the hallway. Same worn jacket, same quiet gaze. But this time a slight tremor in his hands. They shouldn't be here, he said. Julia didn't speak. But I didn't know where else to go. He stepped aside. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, a familiar kind of distance now. I saw the folder, she said softly. I figured you might. You used my laptop. I needed something untraceable. Say, she folded her arms. So you left, hacked a corporation, and came back like a ghost with a USB stick. He smiled faintly. Pretty much. He stared at him, torn between fury and awe. You're not just some lost CEO, Duggar. You're a man in the middle of a war. I never wanted it to be a war, he said, but Victor made it one. He's gutting Harvin Technologies, selling the core divisions to overseas shells, cashing out, and walking clean. No one knows or cares. But I do. Well, he told me this from the beginning. Because the minute you knew, you'd be in it too. He held his gaze. I've been in it since I sat with you on the curb. He went quiet. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a flash drive. This, he said, setting it on the table between them, is everything. It proves the merger is a front, shows the routing paths, the signature fraud, and if I release it wrong, he'll spin it, paint me as unstable, disgraced, a fraud who faked his own death. Julia leaned in. Then we don't release it alone. What do you mean? He picked up the flash drive, turned it over in her fingers. You said I see things others don't. Well, now I see you. And you're not going to win this by hiding. You need someone who believes. I don't want you getting dragged down. Too late. He looked at her, this woman with calloused hands and a resilient spine, and something in him cracked. Not fear. Not doubt. Just the quiet surrender of finally not being alone. They worked until 2 a.m. David explained the internal networks, the forged contracts, the shells that masked millions. Julia mapped it out, color-coded it, designed a timeline. We used to do this for a startup CEO, she said, except that was about coffee bean analytics. He smiled. This is slightly higher stakes. By the time they closed the laptop, the night had turned chaotic. David rested his head on the back of the couch. Julia leaned her shoulder near his potato. Not yet. When did you come back? She asked finally. I saw you in my dreams, he said, but that wasn't the reason. I came back because I didn't want to win this and not have you beside me. The room was still. Julia didn't cry. But the way she looked at him, soft, sure, without conditions, was answer enough. And she reached for his hand. This time, he'd get and pull away. Chump. The girl with the hidden camera. The ballroom was all gold and glass. Soft violins drifted through the air as servers moved like shadows across the polished floor. At every table sat power VCs, executives, influencers dressed in rented confidence and expensive fragrance. But Julia stood behind a server's partition, pressing her fingers to the tiny camera sewn into the button of her charcoal blouse. Her hand was shaking. She was scared, but because she was scared, but because she finally had something to lose. 2 hours earlier, in her apartment, David had placed the camera in her palm. It records the audio and video, he explained. Live syncs to my drive. No one knows you're wearing it, not even security. He stared at the small plastic circle. You're trusting me with this? He nodded. You're the only one I trust. Julia swallowed. And what am I recording exactly? A room full of liars, David said softly, and the man who thinks I'm dead. Now, as she walked through the ballroom, under the guise of event staff, she kept her posture straight and her smile tight. Victor Alden hadn't arrived yet, but the men he controlled already had. Julia recognized some of their names from the documents. Board members, puppet CEOs, attorneys who signed off on shell company deals with perfect smiles and dead eyes. He passed close to one of them, a tall man with a French accent, laughing too loud, and caught the edge of a sentence. Once the papers are signed, Hale and Gray is just a logo, a ghost company, no liabilities, no legacy. He moved down. The camera blinked once. Recording. Upstairs, in a shadowed corner suite, David monitored the feed from his laptop. His heart beat like war drums, but his face stayed calm. Julia was good. Better than he imagined. He walked with purpose, made himself small in the right places, invisible in the others. She was listening, catching fragments, logging names. But when Victor Alden finally entered the ballroom, a storm in a suit, the man hadn't changed it. Perfect gray tie, trademark cufflinks, that confident cruelty in his jaw. But what made David's jaw tighten was the smile Victor gave the room, as if he owned everyone in it. Julia felt it too, the change in the room, like oxygen shifting. Victor moved through the crowd, shaking hands like a politician, each one carefully calculated. He hadn't seen her yet, didn't even glance her way. She took a deep breath, pressed her clipboard to her chest, and walked straight toward him. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, voice clear, confident. Victor turned. She didn't blink. "I have a materials brief for the executive panel. Would you like it delivered to the presentation?" He narrowed his eyes, vaguely annoyed. "Who are you?" "Event coordination. Third party," she lied smoothly, "we're facilitating the digital sign-ins." He waved a hand. "Leave it by the AV booth." "Of course," she smiled, turned and walked away. But she caught it. His voice, his eyes, his control. Now the camera had him crystal clear. Back in the suite, David sat perfectly still. He had what he needed. He waited. He waited for the moment Victor said something arrogant, honest, dangerous. Julia kept drifting closer to him, circling the table like a moth, pretending not to notice the flame. And she heard it. Victor leaned toward one of the Shell CEOs and, "This is the last phase. By Monday I own Hale and Gray. David Hale can stay dead, or come crawling back and sign the merger himself. Either way, I win." The words were clear. The mic caught every syllable. David hit save. Any certain. It was time. Downstairs, Julia stepped outside for air, hand clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. Her chest was heaving, not from fear, but from rage. David had been right. Victor wasn't just a threat to a company. He was erasing people, histories, lives. A moment later, a quiet voice came through her earpiece, something David had tucked into her bag earlier. "I'm on my way." Julia turned. A reflection caught in the mirrored wall beside the entrance. Calm face, steady eyes. But inside she was afire. And 10 minutes later the ballroom doors opened again. And David Hale walked in. No disguise, no hesitation. A tailored black suit, crisp white shirt, no tie. The laughter stopped. The murmurs rose. Someone gasped. Victor froze mid-sentence. David walked toward the center of the room, toward Victor. It was not a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that said, "You should have finished me when you had the chance." Victor's voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." David replied calmly, "And yet, here I am." "You trespass." "No," David said. "I'm reclaiming." He turned to the room. "For those who don't recognize me, my name is David Hale, founder and former CEO of Hale and Gray Technologies, a company I built not with greed but with purpose." The room was silent. Cameras were raised. Recordings had started. "I'm here to tell you," he continued, "that the man standing beside me, Victor Alden, is about to sell this company in a fraudulent merger that will leave it hollowed out and worthless. He is using my name, my legacy, my silence." Victor's face turned red. "The lie," he said through gritted teeth. David gestured toward the AV booth. Julia was already there. With a quiet nod to the technician, she activated the screen behind the stage. The ballroom lights dimmed. A video played. Victor's voice. "By Monday I own Hale and Gray. David Hale can stay dead." An outrun. Then silence again. Victor spun toward David. "You manipulated this." "No," David said, his voice steel. "You." Police entered moments later. Quietly, proficient. Victor didn't resist. He knew. He was gone. Outside the chaos had calmed. David stood near the fountain in the front courtyard, watching the streetlights blink against the pavement. Julia walked toward him slowly. "You did it," she said. "No," he replied. "Did." There was a long pause. Then she reached for his hand. He turned to her. "I don't care about Hale and Gray," he said. "Not anymore. Not if it costs me." He squeezed his hand. "You didn't lose it," she whispered. "I almost did. But you didn't." And in the stillness of that Chicago night, surrounded by everything that had once tried to break them. Two people who were never supposed to meet stood side by side. Not broken. Not hiding. You're speaking. Chapter 7. The letter she couldn't read. Yet. The house was still. Not the kind of stillness that comes from peace, but the kind that fills a space after something important leaves it. Julia stood by the window, one hand around her coffee mug, watching the light crawl across the floor. Her heart should have been lighter. The company was saved. Victor was facing charges. David had reclaimed his name and his dignity. But it didn't feel like a victory. Because he was gone. He hadn't said goodbye, not really. He'd stood together outside the hotel after the confrontation, hands intertwined, silent, a weight lifted between them, but something heavier growing beneath it. He remembered the way he looked at her, like he wanted to stay. But something else, something quiet and unseen, had already begun pulling him away. Now, 3 days later, the apartment was colder. No notes this time, no texts. Just... And then, that morning, a single white envelope tucked inside the spine of her favorite book on the shelf, The Alchemist. Her name written across the front in neat, steady handwriting. Julia. Her fingers hovered over it. Oh, she didn't open it. Oh, not yet. Instead, she stepped outside. The sky was soft and pale above the rooftops. The streets were empty. Her feet led her without thinking past the corner newsstand, past the bakery, past the place where she'd first slipped and spilled her lunch into a stranger's life. He walked to the alley. It was just a slab of forgotten city now. Damp pavement, a few cigarette butts, a broken box. Nothing meaningful unless you knew what had happened there. He sat on the curb. He closed her eyes and let herself remember. The cold, the wound on his foot, the way he said, "I'm between who I was and who I will be." He hadn't known what kind of love begins at the bottom. Back home, she set the envelope on the table. She made herself breakfast, though she didn't touch it. He vacuumed folded laundry, replied to emails from Indigo Systems. And the envelope just sat there, like a question she wasn't ready to answer. That night, she finally opened it. Inside, 2 pages. No business language, no explanations, just David. Julia. I know by the time you find this, because I want to leave you. But because I'm afraid if I stay too long, I'll ruin everything I'd just fixed. I've spent years building things and then I spent months tearing everything down. And you made me want to build again. But not with steel, with quiet, with coffee, with kindness. I don't know what we are, or if we'll ever be something again. But if I don't finish what I started, if I don't rebuild myself, honestly, slowly, I'll never deserve what you gave me. So I'm going to disappear one more time. Not for... just long enough to become someone who can stay. I left my number inside the copy of Leaves of Grass, not because I expect a call, but because I still hope for one. Yours in a way I don't yet understand. Babe. He folded the letter and held it to her chest. There were no tears. But there was that ache, that soft, hollow ache when you know you were loved and left not by betrayal, but by a man still trying to find his way home. Days passed. Then weeks. Julia worked. She kept showing up at Indigo. She took on extra projects, started biking to work, bought herself a better coffee maker. He told no one about David. But some mornings she would sit by the window, holding a mug in her hands, and picture a quiet little cafe far from the city, somewhere green, somewhere with wild flowers by the porch and cinnamon in the air. He wondered if he was there, and if maybe he was wondering about her too. 1 month later, a letter arrived. No return address. Just her name again, Julia, written with the inside a photograph. A small coffee shop, handmade sign, wooden porch, 2 chairs by the window, a faded brick wall painted with the words, "New Beginnings." On the back of the photo, a note. You built something. There's a chair by the window that doesn't make sense without you in it. If you ever want to find me, this is where I'll be. No more hiding. No more pretending. Just real things. Julia sat on the couch, the letter in one hand, the photo in the other, and in the space between breaths, she finally smiled. Because the ache was gone. But because she wasn't afraid of it. He set the photo on the table, next to his first note, next to the envelope. Then she went to her bookshelf, pulled out Leaves of Grass, and found the number tucked inside. She could call it. Not yet, but she saved it in her phone. Give it the real one. And for the first time since the alley, he knew the next chapter wasn't just possible. It was waiting. Chapter 8. The Café called New Beginnings. The bus ride took longer than expected. She spent the hours watching farmland blur into tree canopies, her fingers resting on the edge of her seat, heart beating in an uncertain rhythm. She still hadn't called him. He had read his note, looked at the photo 100 times, saved his number in her phone. But she hadn't dialed. What she was doing now felt more honest. Not a phone call, not a warning. Just show up. The town was smaller than she imagined. It smelled like baked bread and earth. Children rode bikes with streamers. Old couples sat on benches reading actual newspapers. She walked 2 blocks before she saw the sign. New Beginnings carved into weathered wood, painted in soft cream against brick. There were flower boxes under every window. A small patio wrapped around the front with 2 worn chairs. A bell hung from the awning, catching the breeze with a gentle chime. And inside, behind the counter, was David. No suit. No disguise. Just a man wearing a gray apron, sleeves rolled, forearms dusted with flour, laughing quietly with a customer over something about muffins. Julia stood on the sidewalk, frozen. He didn't expect her heart to react like this. Not fear. Not heart. The way you feel when you return to a place you didn't realize you missed. He turned. He saw her through the glass. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the bell chimed as she stepped through the door. She said. Yeah, he repeated. They stood across the counter from each other, sunlight pouring through the windows, the silence full, but unheavy. I didn't call, she said. I know, and didn't know what I'd say. I'm glad you didn't say anything, he said. You came. That's more than I hoped for. Julia glanced around. It was simple, cozy, wooden shelves lined with jars of preserves and books, a chalkboard menu that read, "The day's special, still figuring it out, but cooks with a You really built this," she murmured. He nodded. I wanted something quiet, real, no noise, no markets, just a place where people sit down and taste things again. He smiled. And you want me to work here? No, he said gently. I want you to choose if you want to be here. That's all. She looked down at her hands. Chicago's loud, she said. It always was. I thought if I stayed long enough I'd get used to it. No, she said softly. Oh, I meant. David came out from. He just stood in front of her, hands in his apron pockets, waiting. I don't want to fix you, she said. I'm not broken anymore. I don't want you to save me either. I never try. She hesitated. I want to be somewhere that feels like honest. Then you're that. He sat at the corner table. He brought her coffee. Black strug. The chair by the window was indeed made for someone else. She fit into it like it remembered her. I call this one the quiet chair, David said. People who sit here don't talk unless it really matters. Julia took a sip and looked up at him. Do you still dream of building empires? He shook his head. Now I dream of building muffins without burning them. She laughed. So, muffins over mergers? Muffins, gardens, sunrises. He said it like it wasn't a confession, just a fact. He didn't respond with words. He just reached across the table and placed her hand gently over his. That afternoon she helped with the register, rearranged the books, drew doodles in the corner of the menu board. David didn't hover, he didn't guide, he just watched her quietly like a man seeing something he thought he'd lost. When evening came, they sat on the porch, a soft dusk settling over the town. "Do you think this can last?" she asked. "I don't know," he said, "but I know I don't want to run anymore. And I don't want to live in the kind of love that depends on fixing each other." Julia leaned back in her chair, the wood creaking beneath her. "I don't need big love," she whispered. "I just need true love." David smiled. "Then you're exactly where you're meant to be." As the first stars appeared, the bell over the door jingled again. The couple came in hand, asking if the cafe was still open. David stood, glanced at Julia. She nodded. "A croquette," she said. "You help get them." He paused, watching him move around the room. And for the first time in years, David Hale, the man who had everything, and then, Chapter 9, the proposal with no ring. Julia had begun to forget what waiting felt like. Not because her life had stalled, but because somehow everything in this little town felt like presence. She was no longer bracing for impact. She was no longer surviving her days like they were battles. Instead, she opened the cafe at sunrise. He laughed it with customers. She read the newspaper with her feet tucked under the counter and a pencil behind her ear. She loved David, not as a rescue, not as a mystery, but as a man who showed up early and made the first pot of coffee with one eye still closed. And every day they said nothing about forever. They just lived like it had already begun. This morning the cafe was quiet. David was already outside on the patio, sanding a wooden planter box. He wore his usual apron, but the sleeves of his shirt were rolled all the way up. His forearms were flecked with sawdust. Julia watched from the window, leaning against the frame. Then she stepped out, barefoot, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Truce offering," she said, handing him one. "You're what? We're making you the wrong kind of toast yesterday." He grinned. It wasn't the toast. It was the anchovy butter. He was an experiment. It was a crime. He laughed and sat on the wooden bench across from him. They drank in silence. The world was just starting to hum awake. Birds overhead, wind in the trees, the faint rattle of a bike chain somewhere down the street. David looked at her. "You look different here." "Different? Like you breathe all the way now?" Julia thought about that. "I think I stopped trying to prove myself to the world, to men in suits, to old bosses who never remembered my name." He paused. "And maybe to myself." David's smile softened. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out something small, a piece of string twisted around itself. He held it out between them. He blinked. "Is that yarn?" "It's from your apron," he said, "caught on the cabinet last week. You didn't notice." She raised an eyebrow. "You're proposing with a thread?" "I'm not proposing a wedding," he said. "Not yet. Not until you want one." He set the string gently in her open palm. "I'm proposing we keep building," he said, "one quiet morning at a time." Julia looked down at the thread. It wasn't gold, it wasn't diamond, but it was real. It was them. "Will you?" She proposed with rings, she whispered. He nodded. "I figured we'd start with truth." He met his eyes. "Okay," she said, "but only if you let me put the toast on tomorrow." "No anchovy butter." "No promises?" Later that day, the cafe buzzed with regulars, an elderly couple reading poetry to each other at table 4, 2 teens playing chess by the window, and a mother chasing a toddler who had developed a deep obsession with the napkin holder. David stood by the register. Julia was behind the bar, frothing milk, her hair in a loose bun, her cheeks pink from the spring air. He watched her move, the small, intentional gestures, the way she remembered everyone's name. He had built tech empires, but nothing had ever looked more like success than her pouring coffee and laughing softly at someone's terrible joke. He wiped his hands on a towel, walked behind the bar, and slipped the yarn thread onto her wrist like a bracelet. He glanced down. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" she asked. He leaned in. "Every version of serious I've ever been." That night they closed the cafe slowly. The chairs were up, the counter wiped, a warm playlist still playing softly in the background. Julia locked the front door, then turned toward him in the quiet. "No one clapped," she said. "What?" "For a non-wedding," she teased. "We don't need applause." A shared toothbrush cup and matching opinions about how toast should be made. He stepped closer. "I don't need a ring." He tilted his head. "Maybe someday, but for now." He raised their intertwined hands and kissed the inside of her rib. "This is more than enough." Outside the wind picked up. The cafe sighing swayed gently. But inside there was only light, and warmth, and two people who no longer needed rescue. They had found something steadier. A partnership built from nothing but truth and slow mornings. Chapter 10. The cafe had changed. Yeah, because they remodeled. But because love leaves fingerprints, quiet ones, on windows wiped with care, on books rearranged by mood instead of author, on the chalkboard, where Julia now wrote quotes instead of specials. Today is we. You don't have to fix everything. Some things are beautiful because they stayed. Locals had started calling it Café and Heart, because people said that's what it felt like someone had poured intention into every corner. The name stuck. Julia laughed when she heard it the first time during a farmer's market outside the cafe. She stood by the herb table, holding basil in one hand and David's fingers in the other. "You hear that?" she whispered. "Right there. They're calling it Café and Heart." He looked at her like he always did, like she was the first sunrise. "They're not wrong," he said. Inside, a child colored pictures at the reading nook. A woman wrote poetry in a corner booth. A man left a small envelope by the tip jar that simply read, "Thank you for reminding me how to feel." And behind the counter, Julia poured coffee. Not for customers. For neighbors. For old friends she'd just met. David no longer ran meetings. He made scones instead. He no longer wore $1,000 suits. He wore linen shirts, flower on his sleeve, joy in his chest. When new customers asked about the place, neither of them said much. There was no pitch, no brand story. Just one. We built it for people like us. People who had been lost. Who needed something real. One evening the air buzzed with summer warmth. The back patio was lit with string lights. Someone played soft jazz from a phone propped against a pitcher of lemonade. Julia stepped out with 2 plates of apple tart. David was already sitting at the far table. She joined him. They ate in silence for a while, not because there was nothing to say, but because silence had become their language too. After a few minutes, Julia reached into her apron and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "I want to show you something." He opened it. New side design, hand-sketched in ink, ornate but simple. At the top, Café and Heart. Below it, Where the Lost Feel Found. "You want to rename it?" he asked, voice low. He shrugged. "Feels like it already has." David ran his fingers over the sketch. "It's perfect. I was thinking we put it up on our anniversary." He looked at her, brows raised. He smiled. "The anniversary of the day you offered me a crust of bread and looked at me like I mattered." He shook his head. "I didn't look at you like you mattered. I looked at you like I knew I'd never forget you." Julia leaned back. "Well, you didn't. Not a chance." The night wore on. A breeze danced through the garden. And David, after clearing the plates, returned with something small in his hand. He raised an eyebrow. "Do more strings?" she teased. He sat beside her, holding a small, delicate ring. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't new. But it was his grandmother's, the one he'd kept in his wallet since the night she first treated his wound in that alley. This time he said, "It is a proposal." Juliet went still, not because she was surprised, but because it felt like the moment was always meant to arrive. "I don't want a ceremony," she said quietly. "Me neither. No crowd. No fact. Just a coffee shop," she added. "And a porch. And your heartbeat next to mine." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit. Of course it did. The following morning, Julia changed the sign herself. The neighbors gathered, sipping espresso and clapping politely. Someone cried, someone sang off-key. But most of them just watched as she stood on the ladder, reached up and revealed the new wooden letters. If he had earned it. She turned to David. He mouthed, "Gal." She nodded. And just like that, the story that began in a rain-soaked alley became a home where hearts could rest, a table by the window. The seasons changed slowly in that town. Autumn brought golden leaves and cinnamon in the air. Winter came softly, dusting the sidewalks like powdered sugar, but the warmth inside Café and Heart never faded, because it had never been about the seasons. It had always been about who stayed. Julia still wore the ring David gave. Not because it sparkled, but because it never weighed her down. They never had a wedding. No guest list, no aisle, no tux. Just a table by the window, where they sat each morning, hands wrapped around warm mugs, and the life they had built from almost nothing. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. But they were always there, two people who met at their lowest and chose to stay anyway. There were still hard days. The days when the Café ran out of flour. When Julia missed her grandmother so much she had to step outside to cry. Days when David would read an article about Hale and Gray and feel a tightness in his chest. But the difference now was, they didn't carry things along. They had each other's silence to rest in. Each other's steadiness to lean into. And that was everything. Years later, when travelers stopped into the Café and asked how it all started, Julia would simply smile and point to the corner table. "That's where it began," she'd say. A nightfall, a man with a bleeding foot, and a girl with no lunch. "And how?" someone would ask. And she'd answer, "Now it's a place where people heal." We all carry stories. Some of them begin in boardrooms. Some in back alleys. Some begin the moment everything falls apart, and someone shows up anyway. But the most beautiful stories? They're built in silence, in study, in the simple decision to stay when walking away would have been easier. Because in the end, love doesn't always come with a ring, a vow, or a headline. It's just a warm coffee, a quiet gate, someone whispering, "You matter," even if you don't see it yet. Have you ever loved someone at their lowest and watched them rise? Or maybe you were the one who was helped up from the curb. If this story reminded you of someone, share a piece of it below. Leave a sentence, a memory, a name. Because sometimes we write these stories, but you carry the real ones. And the world still needs stories like yours. With love. From everyone at Café and Heart.